Thank you, Jacob. So my name's Stephen Bray. I'm with the Department of Prime Ministries in Queensland, and have the privilege of being in one of the first working groups on one of the themes for the Bee Sustainability Framework. So I'd really like to thank the team that has kept it going over many years and really been open to developing and improving the tools. So I think that's a really great achievement. My co-author today is Bray Crouch, who's a UQ PhD student, and he was going to be presenting today with me, but he had to go away, so he's did a video which I can share, but I'll be presenting his slides today. So today we're talking about biodiversity and particularly birds, and about how they relate to grazing industry. And to put this in a context, and I acknowledge MLA just released their strategic plan, but in Queensland, DPI are going through quite another strategic planning process at the moment. And just to put in a context is, it's all about prospering, the agriculture industry is prospering, building the agriculture industries to 30 billion by 2030. But as part of that, it's about actually doing that in a sustainable way for present and future generations, and also recognising the environmental stewardship of our farmers. So one project I was involved in up until recently was called Methods to Markets, and it goes along with what we've been talking about today, is how you actually use tools to demonstrate environmental credentials on a beef production business, and more importantly doing that while they're producing beef and being economical and profitable while they're doing that. So some of the key activities as part of that were looking at the grazing business's carbon accounts, supporting satellite-derived estimation of pasture biomass, and we did some work with Phil and his team on that. Supporting some of the work around vegetation cover assessment and how that changes over time. So there's a carbon implications, biodiversity implications, but also grazing productivity implications. And we also supported improvement of the biocondition assessment at the property scale. So biocondition, I'll talk a bit more about that, it's been around for a while, but actually how do you actually look on farms to actually say, is there good stuff happening on farms, and not necessarily that everything has to be in perfect condition, how you actually integrate and understand, even if it's not totally perfect for biodiversity, is it getting to a stage where it's still valuable and also reasonable in a production landscape. So this is an example of property, and our collaborator is always very important for our projects, and some of you may know Melanie's property here, and we're very much grateful to our collaborators. But it's not about saying you're doing a bad job or where you are at the moment. It's about looking at where they are and identifying what they can actually do better for that property. And some example photos there, you've got some regrowth, you've got buffel pasture, you've got some remnant pieces on there, you've got Lakina. And it's actually looking at what they can do to improve things. And you can see a couple of little yellow lines there. That was one of the cases where we thought, oh, maybe we could retain some of the regrowth to actually improve connectivity between those parts of the landscape. So as part of that, and working with the Queensland Herbarium, was about going and assessing biocondition. And it was pretty clear, I know some people argue it, but most of the time it's pretty clear, if you've got remnant vegetation, it's better for biodiversity than a plain grass pasture paddock. But there's a lot of scale or variation of that, and the beauty of biocondition is you can go into those areas and assess a condition score for those different land uses. And the key thing to note there is you've got a scale up the side there. None of those uses are actually zero biocondition values. They've all got some biocondition value, and that's what the beauty of this scoring system is. And when you look at birds as an indicator of biodiversity, and there's a lot of aspects of biodiversity, they generally increase with improvement in biocondition score. So the next stage we've worked with was supporting the data into development of the spatial biocondition tool. And as you can see in the map there, you've got the vegetation map, but using the spatial biocondition tool actually estimate a biocondition rating across that landscape. So it's not just remnant vegetation versus everything else. It's actually a lot more nuance to that. And that gives us a lot better ability to start looking on farm what people can actually do to actually improve that connectivity, to improve that balance, and start assessing if you make a change, what difference you might actually have to those impact on biodiversity. And we've actually got a project proposal at the moment to further develop this for the property scale and across more of Queensland, but importantly make it available to producers through the forage suite of reports, and a lot of landholders in Queensland access that for their pasture cover and pasture productivity or land type data, but also make the base data available to other ESG frameworks. But there is additional work that's required, and it's about how you actually look at how you actually enhance that biodiversity efficiently on farm to minimise impact on productivity, and also just understand things like how much vegetation do you require on farm to be doing good enough in a production environment, and what happens if you change the spatial arrangement of that woody vegetation. So I'll lead on to presenting Brodie Crouch's slides. So Brodie did some work with us on that previous project, but he's currently doing his PhD and expanding on some of those concepts. And Brodie's really keen for feedback at his PhD. He's about halfway through at the moment, so if you have some good feedback from what I'm presenting here today, please get back to me or directly to Brodie. We really appreciate that. So Brodie's case study area is in the Brigalow belt, which is characterised by pretty fertile soils, but it has been subject to a lot of vegetation change. The original vegetation on a lot of that country looked like that, which had relatively low grazing value. So through the Brigalow development scheme, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of that has been cleared. And just to give you some sort of sense of scale of that, the blue in this image is the Brigalow land types in that region. And if you look at the what's left today, the blue there is what's still remnant or close to remnant vegetation. So the connectivity has been very severely impacted. It's had very big impacts though on regional development and beef industry profitability and the growth of the beef industry. But it has, you can see the scale of difference there, it's going to have an impact on the biodiversity. So how can we reverse some of that and improve the impact? Along with that, with Brigalow, which is a bit different to some of the other vegetation types across Australia, it is very good at regrowing from clearing events. And there's an example of regrowth here. So you saw the big trees in the previous photo. You cleared them and you get a big lot of these suckers coming up, which required re-clearing, sorry, because if you look underneath the photo there, there's very little pasture production when the regrowth is thick like that. So there is a need for that re-clearing events, and again, balancing that with production. But we do know that that regrowth does have quite high biodiversity values. And a couple of the things there are the painted honeyeater and the bridal male-tail wallaby, which are on the endangered list. And so this regrowth provides us an opportunity to do something if we want to retain more vegetation on farm. So Brodie's work is, each of those yellow circles is where one of his sites, and they're about 1,200 hectares each, and across 19 cattle properties and also 3 national parks. So he's done a significant amount of field work in those areas. And so within those areas, he's looked at from woody cover on the side there, so from sites where there's very little vegetation, right up to the some of the reserves where there's nearly 100% vegetation there. And the blue's remnant vegetation, which means it's pretty much never been cleared, and regrowth, which has been growing back. Wrong way. So a couple of examples of that is property which has been quite heavily cleared. There's property where there's some regrowth strips still on the property. A place where there's some bigger patches of brigalow still left and strips voluntarily kept. This site is one where they've been using it for offset, so it's probably sold to industry where they're doing some other clearing activity, and a national park. So a very large range of covers and impacts across those landscapes. So within an area, you select some sample sites, and they range from remnant vegetation to some regrowth, to some leucaena, some buffer pastures, to actually characterise what's going on in that landscape. So one of his main biodiversity tools is bird surveys, and he spends time out on these producers' properties, and they've really been getting involved with this work and coming out and supporting him when he's doing his surveys. In the Callide Valley, he sort of says there's quite a competition for who's got the biggest bird list in that region at the moment, so it's been really good to get those producers on board. And what's he expecting the output to be? So up the side there is the woodland bird species that you might expect in that region, and across the bottom is the amount of forest cover. So based on previous work, you expect as you get more cover in an area, the number of birds will go up, but then it'll get to a plateau where it's still trending up, and there'll be some bird species that really need those large intact areas, but there should be a point where it actually flattens off in a productive landscape where you're doing a pretty good job for your birds. It may not be perfect, but looking at where that balance or sweet spot might start to be. And I've seen some of Brody's early data, and it does fit that pattern quite well. So it's one part of just having the data, but then it's fitting it into the frameworks and getting the recognition for industry. And as we all know in this room, there's a lot of global frameworks wanting to demonstrate what's happening across agricultural landscapes, from EU law-based and trade-based systems to more voluntary systems. So key part of this kind of work is actually feed into those to provide the base data, not necessarily run the framework, but provide the data we can use to inform those kind of frameworks. And using this type of work, it's about actually developing remote sense-based and farm-scale ecosystem assessments where we can actually use these kind of data, make sure they're scientifically based and feed into those kind of frameworks. And the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework is one of those. So where Brody's trying to get to is to go onto a property, look at where they're at. This is not using a biocondition data at this stage, it's a more simple classification of vegetation, but he's looking at possibly incorporating the biocondition data, but actually looking at where they are and how they can actually move forward into the future. So there's one part about what the impact is of holding more or retaining more woody vegetation for biodiversity. The other part is what the impact is on the productive business. And in Brody's words, most producers know that the more trees you have, generally the less grass you have, which is a pretty well-established relationship, but there is going to be a sweet spot there somewhere. So one of the things he's looking at is some of the potential benefits of vegetation on cattle productivity. And to do this, he's using collars to look at where cattle might use that trees in the landscape and what the impact of shade and shelter and the impact of frost might actually have on improving that productive benefits. So bringing it all together, you see the woodland bird species richest graph, which I showed earlier. Looking at as a habitat cover or woody cover increases, what the impact is on beef productivity, taking into account animal welfare as well as forage production, but also looking at other aspects such as carbon storage and water quality too, of what's in trying to bring all those ESG type measurements into that business. And then try and look at, if they're already down in the very low habitat cover, that's kind of the pattern you get, and it's probably not optimum for anything right down that end. But what happens when you start moving along that line and around the 20-30% habitat cover, trying to find that sweet spot where it's good for maintaining most of the biodiversity, won't be perfect for everything, but also reasonable balance with productivity and those other attributes. So as I mentioned, please contact Brodie, if you'd like to provide any more feedback on his work, and I'd like to call it there. Thanks a second.